Welcome to Mystery Unlocked, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1. The Portrait's Cursor. Quentin Derwent's voice rang sharply through the drawing room. Utter nonsense, he scoffed, setting his brandy glass down with an audible clink. A curse, indeed. You'd think we were still living in the Middle Ages. Edward Bryce, the distinguished art historian, adjusted his spectacles and sighed. I merely said the portrait has a rather unfortunate history, Sir Quentin. The deaths of its previous owners are well documented. Lavinia Derwent, seated with crossed arms, smirked. If you ask me, uncle, it's rather thrilling. Imagine a painting that dooms its owner. People do love a good ghost story. People love a scandal, Sir Quentin retorted. And fools love a superstition. But this is a work of art, not some pagan idol. He waved a dismissive hand at the portrait hanging above the fireplace. The painting was of a solemn-looking gentleman, his dark eyes seeming to follow the room's occupants. It had changed hands many times, always accompanied by whispers of misfortune. Sir Quentin, a shrewd collector, had acquired it at an estate auction 6 months prior. Despite dire warnings from those who knew its history, Margaret Felsham, the former housekeeper of the portrait's original owner, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I remember Mr. Ashcombe, she murmured, the first man to own it. He died in his study, just as you have arranged yours, Sir Quentin. A cold silence fell over the room. Sir Quentin chuckled, though his eyes were not amused. Well then, I shall sleep soundly tonight, knowing I am in excellent company. A dark discover later that evening, the household settled. Lavinia retired to her room, Margaret disappeared to her modest quarters, and Edward Bryce sat up in the library, making notes on an upcoming lecture. It was just past midnight when the stillness of the house was shattered by a scream. Within moments, Lavinia came rushing down the hall, nightgown billowing. What is it? She gasped. Margaret stood at the entrance to Sir Quentin's study, a hand to her throat. It's Sir Quentin, she whispered hoarsely. Edward arrived just as Lavinia pushed past the older woman and stepped inside. Sir Quentin was slumped in his chair, his face ashen, his fingers curled over the armrest as though in protest. His lifeless eyes were fixed on the portrait above the fireplace. The room reeked of something sharp, something unnatural. Inspector Graves arrived not long after, summoned by the frantic calls to the village constabulary. He took one look at the scene and exhaled through his nose. Looks like heart failure, he said, though his voice lacked certainty. Miss Marple, who had been staying in the village and heard of the incident through her usual network of gossiping acquaintances, arrived the next morning. She peered at Sir Quentin's body with quiet interest. No signs of struggle, she murmured. Yet his expression. He looks startled, does he not? Edward Bryce nodded grimly. If he truly believed the painting was harmless, why would he look so terrified? A troubling clue. Yes, the morning sun streamed through the curtains. Inspector Graves moved methodically through the room. He checked Sir Quentin's desk, the bookshelves, even the drinks cabinet. No forced entry, he muttered. No sign of struggle. Miss Marple ran a delicate finger along the surface of the brandy glass left by Sir Quentin the night before. Inspector, have you considered poison? Graves scoffed. No evidence of such. Likely, just his heart giving out. He wasn't a young man. But not an old man either, Miss Marple mused. She examined the brandy decanter, tilting it slightly. Perhaps we should have this tested, don't you think? Edward looked uneasy. You truly suspect foul play? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the portrait. I suspect, she said softly, that curses do not kill men. People do. The room grew silent. Margaret Felsham, who had been quietly observing, clasped her hands. Sir Quentin was convinced the painting was valuable. He had me dust it every morning. But he also mentioned finding something hidden. A letter, I think. A letter. Lavinia frowned. I never saw any letter. Miss Marple turned back to the inspector. Would you mind terribly if we had a look around? Graves hesitated but gestured for them to proceed. Miss Marple walked to the portrait and examined the frame. With careful fingers, she traced the edge of the gilded wood and pressed lightly on one corner. Something shifted. A folded piece of paper slipped from a hidden compartment behind the canvas, landing silently on the desk. The room held its breath. Miss Marple unfolded the aged paper and scanned its contents. Her expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened ever so slightly. "Well," she said at last, "this is interesting." Chapter 2. Whispers of the pasta. Hushed tension settled over the study as Miss Marple tucked the letter into her handbag. The others stared at her expectantly, waiting for an explanation. Inspector Graves crossed his arms. "Come now, Miss Marple. This is a police investigation. I'll be the judge of what's important." Miss Marple gave him a mild smile. "Of course, Inspector, but you see, sometimes it is better to let people reveal themselves before we ask too many questions. If someone here recognizes this letter, they will be unable to hide their reaction for long." Lavinia Derwent scoffed. "That sounds rather theatrical." Miss Marple turned her sharp gaze on the young woman. "Not at all, my dear. People are very much like teapot supply, the right amount of heat, and eventually, something will whistle." Edward Bryce cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on what's important, sir. Quentin's death. If there was something in that letter that worried him, surely we should know what it is." Miss Marple inclined her head but said nothing. Instead, she took a slow step toward the portrait and ran her fingers along the frame once more. Margaret Felsham watched her with a haunted expression. "I told you, that painting brings nothing but misfortune." Lavinia rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Uncle Quentin was a skeptic. He would never have been frightened to death over some ridiculous superstition." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But perhaps someone wanted us to think he was." The portrait's historiette moved from the study to the sitting room, where the household gathered at Inspector Graves' insistence. There, over cups of weak tea and untouched biscuits, the conversation turned to the portrait's history. Edward Bryce, ever the historian, sat forward. The portrait originally belonged to a man named Leonard Ashcombe, a collector much like Sir Quentin. He was found dead in his study nearly 30 years ago. Margaret, who had been silent until now, nodded. "I was his housekeeper then." Miss Marple turned to her gently. "What do you remember about his death, Mrs. Felsham?" Margaret's fingers tightened around her teacup. "They said it was his heart, just like Sir Quentin. But I never believed it." She hesitated, glancing at the inspector. "You see, Mr. Ashcombe had a visitor that evening, a man who was never identified. He was seen leaving the house in a hurry." "A visitor, Inspector Graves?" asked. Margaret nodded. "Mr. Ashcombe had been acting strangely for days. He kept speaking of something valuable he had found. He locked himself in his study that night, and by morning, he was dead." Miss Marple's lips pursed, and the portrait, Margaret sighed. "Sold at auction. It changed hands several times. Each time, someone close to it died under strange circumstances." Lavinia snorted. "So you think a painting is running around murdering people?" Miss Marple merely smiled. "Paintings do not kill, Miss Derwent, but people. Ah, that is another matter entirely." A curious absenteeist, the conversation stretched on. Miss Marple quietly observed the room's occupants. Edward Bryce, fidgeting with his pocket watch. Lavinia, arms crossed, impatience flickering in her eyes. Margaret Felsham, looking at the floor as though burdened by something unspoken. Only one person was missing. "Where is Reverend Mallory?" Miss Marple asked suddenly. Inspector Graves frowned, said he'd be here shortly. Mentioned something about an errand. "How odd," Miss Marple murmured. "And on such an occasion," Edward leaned forward. "Do you think the Reverend has something to do with this?" "Oh, I wouldn't say that." Miss Marple took a sip of her tea. "But I do believe he knows more than he lets on." A disturbing revelation. It was nearly noon when Reverend Mallory finally arrived. His expression flustered. "Apologies, apologies," he said breathlessly. "Terrible business. This terrible business." Miss Marple studied him. "You seem troubled, Reverend." He hesitated. "It's just, I don't know if I should speak of it." Lavinia groaned. "For heaven's sake, out with it." Mallory's hands twisted together. "Last night I received an anonymous letter." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A letter, you say?" The Reverend nodded. "Slipped under the church door. It warned me to stay away from Sir Quentin's house, said the curse was real." Inspector Graves exhaled sharply. "And you didn't think to mention this sooner?" Mallory shook his head. "I thought it was nonsense. But then this morning, I heard of Sir Quentin's death." Miss Marple reached for her handbag. "Perhaps, Reverend, you would be interested in this letter as well." She retrieved the aged document she had found behind the portrait and unfolded it carefully. As she began to read, a hush fell over the room. "My dearest friend," the letter began, "I fear I have uncovered something dreadful. I cannot say more, only that I must hide what I have found. If I am discovered, know that the danger lies not in the painting itself, but in what it conceals." The letter was unsigned. Edward Bryce paled. That could be Ashcombe's handwriting. Margaret let out a quiet gasp. "Oh Lord." Miss Marple's gaze swept over them. "The question, then, is this: what was Ashcombe so afraid of? And did Sir Quentin discover it as well?" A weighted silence followed. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "We'll need to search this house from top to bottom." Miss Marple tapped a finger against the letter. "Not the house, Inspector." She looked up at the portrait. "We should be looking here. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments." Bellow Chapter 3. Secrets in the Frame. Inspector Graves stood with his hands on his hips, glaring up at the portrait, as if daring it to reveal its secrets. "So, you think the answer lies in the painting?" he asked, his tone skeptical. But Miss Marple gave him a pleasant smile. "I find it curious, Inspector, that both Mr. Ashcombe and Sir Quentin seemed to believe the painting held some hidden truth. If Sir Quentin found something worth hiding, wouldn't it make sense to look where he looked?" Lavinia sighed impatiently. "Honestly, all this fuss over a bit of canvas." Miss Marple turned to her. "You were rather dismissive of the idea of a curse last night, yet you seemed quite disturbed by the portrait earlier. A contradiction, wouldn't you say?" Lavinia stiffened but said nothing. Edward Bryce cleared his throat. "The painting has a rather elaborate frame. It wouldn't be the first time something valuable was concealed within one." Inspector Graves muttered something under his breath before signaling his constable. "Well, we'd better have a look, then. Bring me a ladder." A few moments later, the heavy portrait was carefully lifted from its place above the fireplace. As the constable steadied it, Inspector Graves ran his fingers along the thick, gilded frame. "Nothing unusual here," he grumbled. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes keen. "Perhaps not on the surface, Inspector. But if I may suggest, try pressing along the bottom edge." Graves gave her a wary look before obliging. His fingers pressed against the ornate carvings, and suddenly a faint click. A small compartment slid open at the base of the frame. Everyone leaned in. Inside was a folded slip of paper, yellowed with age. Graves plucked it out, unfolded it, and scanned the words. His eyes darkened. "Well?" Lavinia asked impatiently. Graves read aloud. "The debt is settled. He knows nothing, but if the painting resurfaces, so will the truth. Destroy it." The signature was smeared, unreadable. Margaret Felsham's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh dear Lord." Edward Bryce's face had gone pale. "This means Ashcombe was silenced, doesn't it?" Miss Marple nodded. "And I dare say Sir Quentin may have realized the same thing." The weight of the passroom sat in stunned silence, the letter lying between them like an accusation. Reverend Mallory, who had been quiet up to this point, adjusted his collar. "If this letter is truly connected to Ashcombe's death, then we must ask who sent it." Inspector Graves grunted. "More importantly, who was supposed to receive it?" Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the paper. "The wording suggests it was written after Ashcombe's death, which means," Edward finished her thought, "someone killed him to keep something quiet, and they were afraid it might be discovered later." Lavinia frowned. "But what does that have to do with Uncle Quentin?" Margaret, still looking shaken, spoke softly. "He told me, just 2 nights ago, that he had found something shocking. Something that made him question everything he knew about the painting's history." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "And now, he is dead." Margaret swallowed. "Yes, a troubling theory." Inspector Graves rubbed his chin. "So, let's say Sir Quentin found this note. Maybe he was planning to investigate. Maybe he even confronted someone about it. If that's the case, then his death wasn't an accident at all." Miss Marple smiled. "I do believe you're finally catching on." Inspector Graves shot her a look, but did not argue. Lavinia sighed. "This is all very dramatic. But who exactly are we supposed to suspect? Half the people involved in this 30-year-old business must be dead by now." Miss Marple's expression did not waver. "Not all of them, my dear." Silence. Then, slowly, all eyes turned toward Margaret Felsham. Margaret's face drained of color. "You can't possibly think," Inspector Graves frowned. "You were Ashcombe's housekeeper, weren't you? You worked for him. You were in the house the night he died." Margaret clutched her hands together. "I was, but I had nothing to do with his death." Miss Marple studied her closely. "Perhaps not, but you know something, don't you?" Margaret's lips trembled. I don't know." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. My dear, that's not quite the same as saying no. Margaret closed her eyes. I never saw the letter before, I swear it. But Mr. Ashcombe did have enemies. He made some very foolish investments, and there were whispers about debts unpaid, about people who wanted him ruined. Edward Bryce leaned forward. People like Sir Quentin. Margaret shook her head. No, not him, but someone else. Someone who had power. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. And someone who might have wanted the portrait hidden away. Margaret's hands trembled. I don't know. Inspector Graves exhaled sharply. Well, I'll be looking into it, that's for certain. A new suspect. At that moment, the door creaked open, and a maid hesitantly stepped inside. Begging your pardon, sir, she said, addressing the inspector, but there's a gentleman at the door. Says he was an associate of Sir Quentin's, a Mr. Howard Gillingham. Edward Bryce sat up straighter. Gillingham. I know that name. He's an art dealer. Shady reputation. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Now, isn't that interesting? Graves nodded to the maid. Bring him in. A moment later, a tall man with slicked back hair entered. He had the air of someone who was used to commanding attention. Terrible business, he said smoothly, nodding to the inspector. I only just heard. Came to see if there was anything I could do. Miss Marple watched him keenly. How very kind of you, Mr. Gillingham. And how, may I ask, did you know Sir Quentin? Gillingham flashed a grin. Business, of course. He was interested in certain rare acquisitions. Edward's mouth pressed into a thin line. You mean dubious acquisitions? Gillingham shrugged. Call them what you like. He knew the value of what he had. Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. And what, precisely, was he planning to do with the portrait? Gillingham's smile faltered. Inspector Graves caught the hesitation. I think you'd better start talking, Mr. Gillingham. Gillingham hesitated, then sighed. Fine. Quentin called me a few days ago. Said he'd found something that could change everything. Miss Marple nodded. Something hidden in the portrait, perhaps. Gillingham glanced at the empty space where the painting had hung. Maybe, but whatever it was enough for him to be worried. Inspector Graves straightened. And now he's dead. Gillingham met his gaze, and I had nothing to do with it. Miss Marple tilted her head. Ah, but someone did. Chapter 4. The man who knew Howard Gillingham stood in the center of the room, the weight of suspicion pressing against him. Inspector Graves narrowed his eyes. You say, Sir Quentin called you a few days ago, claiming he had found something. What exactly did he mean? Gillingham hesitated, then adjusted his cufflinks with an air of practiced confidence. He didn't say outright, only that he had uncovered something within the portrait's history, something valuable. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but her eyes sharpened. And yet, Mr. Gillingham, if this discovery was purely academic, why would Sir Quentin feel worried? Gillingham gave her a sidelong glance. He didn't elaborate. Edward Bryce scoffed. How very convenient. Lavinia, arms crossed, let out an impatient sigh. So what now? Are we to assume my uncle found something so dangerous that it got him killed? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. That would certainly explain the manner of his death, Inspector Graves grunted. A heart attack, the doctor said. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, but there's something quite peculiar about that. Graves exhaled. Of course there is. She ignored his sarcasm. Sir Quentin was an aging man, but he was in good health. There were no prior complaints of heart trouble, no signs of strain. And yet, he died suddenly, just as he discovered something. Margaret Felsham, who had remained quiet thus far, whispered, just like Mr. Ashcombe. A heavy silence followed. Anew led Miss Marple's hands smoothed over her skirt. Tell me, Mr. Gillingham, when exactly did Sir Quentin call you? Gillingham frowned. The day before last, and he was alive when you last spoke to him, obviously. Miss Marple smiled. And yet, not 24 hours later, he was dead. Gillingham's posture stiffened. If you're suggesting I had anything to do with it, you're barking up the wrong tree. Inspector Graves nodded. Do you have an alibi, Mr. Gillingham? Gillingham's jaw tightened. I was in London, dealing with a business transaction. You can check with my secretary. I will, Graves assured him. Miss Marple turned toward the empty space where the portrait had once hung. Tell me, Mr. Gillingham, what was Sir Quentin planning to do with the painting? Gillingham exhaled. He wanted to have it examined by an expert, someone who could determine if there was anything hidden within the layers of paint. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. How very interesting. A second letter at that moment, the maid entered, carrying a small envelope. Begging your pardon, sir, she addressed Inspector Graves, but we just found this in Sir Quentin's desk. Thought it might be important. Graves took the envelope and opened it. As he read, his expression darkened. Well, what is it? Edward asked. Graves looked up. Another letter. This one's addressed to Sir Quentin himself. Says, I know what you found. Do not speak of it. Destroy it, or you will regret it. Margaret gasped. Miss Marple took the letter and examined it closely. No signature, just like the other one. Graves muttered under his breath. Seems like someone wanted that painting destroyed. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. But instead of destroying it, Sir Quentin chose to investigate, and now, he is dead. Lavinia, visibly pale, shook her head. This is madness. Edward glanced toward the door. Perhaps we should check Sir Quentin's study. If he found something, he may have left a clue. A study in Shadow's group moved toward Sir Quentin's study, a dark, wood-paneled room lined with books and art. Inspector Graves motioned for the constable to search the desk, while he and Miss Marple examined the shelves. It was Miss Marple who noticed it first, a faint scratch near the corner of the desk, as if something had been dragged across it. She pointed it out to Graves. What do you make of this? Graves frowned and followed the mark. It led to a small cabinet with a locked drawer. Constable, he ordered, see if you can get this open. A moment later, the drawer was forced open, revealing a bundle of papers. Miss Marple carefully sifted through them. At the very bottom lay a single sheet, on which Sir Quentin had scrawled a hurried note. If anything happens to me, the answer lies with the man who last owned the painting. Everyone looked up. Edward spoke first. That would be Leonard Ashcombe. But he's dead, Margaret whispered. Miss Marple tapped the paper lightly. Yes, but there may be someone still alive who knew what Ashcombe was trying to hide. A name from the past. Inspector Graves took a deep breath. All right, we need to trace the ownership of this painting. If Sir Quentin was looking into it, there has to be a record. Miss Marple turned to Gillingham. Would you happen to know, Mr. Gillingham? Gillingham hesitated. Perhaps, but it'll take some digging. Miss Marple smiled. I believe that would be worth our time. Graves nodded. We'll also check Sir Quentin's correspondence. If he reached out to anyone about this, we need to know. Lavinia huffed. We're chasing ghosts. Miss Marple turned to her with a pleasant smile. Ghosts do not write threatening letters, Mr. Went. Lavinia paled but said nothing. The unfinished letter. Margaret suddenly gasped. She had been looking through another pile of papers when her fingers froze over a half-written letter in Sir Quentin's handwriting. Look at this, she whispered. The letter read, My dear friend, I have uncovered something astonishing. The truth about Ashcombe's portrait is more than mere legend. I must speak with you at once. The danger is real, and I fear. The letter ended abruptly. Miss Marple read it over twice. It seems, she said quietly, that Sir Quentin was about to reveal something very important, but he never had the chance. Graves nodded, which means whoever silenced him knew he was close to the truth. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Then we must find out what Sir Quentin discovered. Edward Bryce, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. There's someone else who might know. Miss Marple turned to him. Oh, he hesitated. There was another man someone Ashcombe confided in. I don't know his name, but I believe he was a solicitor. Inspector Graves straightened. Then we'll find out who he is. Miss Marple gave a knowing smile. Yes, I rather think we should. The weight of the mystery hung in the air as they looked at one another. Somewhere, buried in the past, lay the truth, and Miss Marple intended to uncover it. Chapter 5. The Solicitors. Secret morning air carried a crisp chill as Miss Marple and Inspector Graves made their way toward the offices of Harold Newcombe, a name unearthed from Sir Quentin's correspondence. According to Edward Bryce, Newcombe had been Leonard Ashcombe's solicitor and, if anyone knew about the painting's hidden past, it would be him. I don't suppose he'll be pleased to see us, Graves muttered as they reached the modest brick building with its neatly polished sign, Newcombe and Wells, Solicitors. Miss Marple gave him a kindly smile. Few people welcome unwelcome questions, Inspector, but the truth often lies in the reluctant answers. Graves sighed. Let's get on with it. A cautious man. Harold Newcombe was a thin, balding man with a wary expression. He adjusted his spectacles as they introduced themselves, his gaze darting between them. I fail to see what business this is of mine, he said crisply. Graves folded his arms. Sir Quentin Derwent was murdered, Mr. Newcombe. We believe it's linked to a certain portrait. He was investigating one previously owned by Leonard Ashcombe. Newcombe's fingers twitched. Murdered. I was under the impression he suffered a heart attack. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. That was the official verdict, yes. But one must always look beyond appearances, mustn't one? Newcombe hesitated, then cleared his throat. I don't see how I can help you. Graves leaned forward. We have reason to believe that Ashcombe himself was silenced because of that painting. If you have any knowledge that could help us, you'd do well to speak now. Newcombe's jaw tightened. Mr. Ashcombe was a private man. He had affairs he wished to keep discreet. Miss Marple nodded. Such as debts, or matters more unsavory. A flicker of something crossed Newcombe's face. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple studied him keenly. Come now, Mr. Newcombe. If there was nothing to hide, why did Sir Quentin receive a threatening letter, warning him to destroy the painting? Newcombe paled. His fingers fumbled as he reached for a pen on his desk, turning it absently. Miss Marple softened her tone. Whatever secrets Mr. Ashcombe took to his grave, someone is still willing to kill to keep them buried. There was a long silence. Then, finally, Newcombe exhaled. Very well, I'll tell you what I know. The hidden connection. Wockham leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Years ago, Leonard Ashcombe came to me with an unusual request. He wanted to alter his will. There was a certain individual he wished to leave a sum of money to. Miss Marple's ears perked up. An individual, not a relative. Newcombe shook his head. No, a woman. Graves frowned. A mistress. Newcombe hesitated. Not exactly. He referred to her as a mistake he couldn't erase. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And her name? Newcombe sighed. Eleanor Hargreaves. The name sent a ripple through the room. Graves scowled. I've heard that name before. Miss Marple nodded. As have I. Edward Bryce, who had accompanied them, and stood quietly until now, finally spoke. Eleanor Hargreaves was a servant in the Ashcombe household, wasn't she? Newcombe's lips pressed into a thin line. For a time, but there was more to it than that. Miss Marple tilted her head. Do go on. Newcombe took a steadying breath. Eleanor was dismissed under difficult circumstances. Shortly after Ashcombe became obsessed with that portrait, he refused to part with it, even when his financial troubles worsened. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against her handbag. And did you ever meet Miss Hargreaves? Newcombe hesitated. No, she disappeared. Graves raised an eyebrow. Disappeared. Newcombe nodded. Vanished completely. No known relatives, no forwarding address. Ashcombe never spoke of her again. But he continued to make payments to a private account. One I later discovered was linked to her. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. You believe she blackmailed him? Newcombe hesitated. I cannot say for certain. But whatever happened between them, it was enough to make him desperate. A chilling thought. Graves leaned forward. And the portrait, how does it fit into all this? Newcombe swallowed. I don't know exactly, but I do know this Leonard Ashcombe was afraid of it. He kept it covered for years, refused to let anyone near it. And then, one day, he simply gave it away. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. Gave it away, not sold. Newcombe shook his head. No, he practically forced it on Sir Quentin, urging him to take it far away. Said he didn't want it in his house. A moment longer. Edward frowned. Why would he do that? Miss Marple's voice was quiet. Because he knew it was dangerous. Graves scowled. And yet, Quentin brought it back into the light. And now he's dead. Newcombe hesitated, then added, before Ashcombe died, he made one final request of me, one I never understood at the time. Miss Marple looked at him expectantly. And what was that? Newcombe's voice dropped. He asked me to ensure the portrait was destroyed. A heavy silence followed. A missing piece. Miss Marple smoothed her gloves. Tell me, Mr. Newcombe, where might we find records of Eleanor Hargreaves? Newcombe sighed. If she's still alive, I haven't the faintest idea where she might be. Graves grunted. We'll see about that. Edward Bryce rubbed his chin. It's possible she changed her name. If she disappeared all those years ago, she wouldn't have wanted to be found. Miss Marple smiled knowingly. Indeed, but secrets have a way of surfacing when least expected. As they left the solicitor's office, Inspector Graves turned to Miss Marple. What do you make of it? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I think we must find Eleanor Hargreaves. Inspector, I dare say she holds the key to everything. Graves sighed. And where do you propose we start looking? Miss Marple gave him a pleasant smile. Oh, I imagine she's not as far away as we think. And with that, they stepped into the crisp morning air. The weight of a decades-old secret pressing closer with every step. Chapter 6. The woman in the shadows. Scent of old paper and ink filled the dimly lit records office as Inspector Graves impatiently drummed his fingers against the desk. A stout woman with a severe expression adjusted her spectacles and peered at Miss Marple. "You say you're looking for an Eleanor Hargreaves?" she asked, shuffling through a thick stack of documents. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Yes, my dear, we believe she may have changed her name. Could we perhaps start with employment records from the Ashcombe household?" The woman pursed her lips. "It's all rather old, but I'll see what I can find." She disappeared into the back room, leaving Miss Marple and Inspector Graves waiting in silence. Graves let out a sigh. Chasing ghosts again. Miss knitting needles clicked softly as she worked. "Not ghosts, Inspector, just a woman who learned how to disappear." Edward Bryce, who had joined them at Miss Marple's request, leaned forward. "And yet, if Leonard Ashcombe continued sending her money, she must have left some trace." Before Miss Marple could reply, the woman returned with a faded folder. "Here we are. Eleanor Hargreaves worked as a lady's maid for Mrs. Ashcombe." Miss Marple's smile remained polite. "And did she leave under difficult circumstances?" The woman sniffed. "You could say that. She was dismissed rather suddenly. No explanation given." Graves frowned. No mention of where she went. The woman squinted at the papers. "Ah, wait, there's a note here. She applied for a position at the White Hart in a few months later." Edward's brow furrowed. "That name sounds familiar." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. It's in the next village over." Graves grunted. "Then that's our next stop." A face from the past. White Hart Inn was a modest establishment. The kind of place where locals gathered for quiet conversation over warm ale. Miss Marple and the others stepped inside. The air thick with the scent of roasting meat and pipe smoke. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes and neatly pinned hair was polishing glasses behind the bar. She looked up as they approached. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple greeted warmly. "Might I trouble you for a word?" The woman sighed. "If you're selling something, I've no interest." Miss Marple chuckled. "Not at all, dear. We were wondering if you might recall an Eleanor Hargreaves." The woman froze, her grip tightening on the glass. Graves, ever direct, leaned forward. "You know the name." The woman hesitated, then put the glass down carefully. "I might." Edward Bryce watched her keenly. "And who might you be?" she exhaled. "My name is Ellen Harris." Miss Marple's smile didn't falter. "Ellen Harris, or Eleanor Hargreaves." A sharp silence fell. Ellen's eyes darted to the door, as though considering escape, but Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "There's no need to be afraid, my dear. We're only seeking the truth." Ellen exhaled, her shoulders slumping. "It was a long time ago." Graves pulled out his notebook. "Then start from the beginning." "The Ashcombe Eleanor sighed. "I was young when I worked for the Ashcombes. Leonard Ashcombe was kind at first, but then things changed." Edward's expression darkened. "He hurt you?" Ellen shook her head. "Not in the way you're thinking. But he used me, in a different sense. He trusted me with things I never wanted to know." Miss Marple nodded, encouragingly. "Go on, dear." Ellen hesitated. "It was the painting." Graves leaned forward. "The cursed portrait." Ellen laughed bitterly. "It's not cursed, but it was dangerous. Ashcombe told me something about it, something I was never meant to hear." Edward's jaw tightened. "And what was that?" Ellen looked around the inn cautiously, then lowered her voice. "The painting wasn't just a portrait, it was a message." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her knitting. "A message?" Ellen nodded. "Ashcombe had it for years, and during that time, he discovered something. He said the painting hid a secret, something that could ruin him." Graves scowled. "Then why didn't he destroy it?" Ellen's eyes flickered with something close to fear. "Because he didn't dare." The truth beneath the paint. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "What exactly did he say to you?" Ellen hesitated, then whispered. "He said the painting was layered, that underneath the surface, there was another image, one that could not be revealed." Edward stiffened. "You mean there's another painting beneath the portrait?" Ellen nodded. "That's why Ashcombe was so afraid. He believed that if anyone discovered it, his life would be over." Graves rubbed his temples. "So Sir Quentin must have realized this when he started investigating." Ellen's face turned grim. "Yes, and now he's dead." Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. And Leonard Ashcombe, did he ever mention what exactly was hidden beneath the paint? Ellen hesitated, not directly, but I heard him say something once, something I never forgot. They all waited. Ellen's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, "If the truth is ever seen, I will be hanged." A chill ran through the group. A dangerous revelation. Graves was the first to recover. That means whatever was underneath could expose a crime. Miss Marple nodded. A crime so grave that it terrified him for years. Edward exhaled. And now, whoever killed Sir Quentin must have realized he was close to uncovering it. Ellen's voice was small. "I never wanted any of this." Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "You only wished to survive, dear. And you did." Graves straightened. "One thing's clear, we need to examine that painting. If there is another image beneath it, we must find out what it is." Edward hesitated. "But the painting is missing." Graves scowled. "Then we find it." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Ellen. You've been most helpful." Ellen gave a tired nod. "Just be careful." Ashcombe was scared for a reason. Miss Marple's expression was kind but firm. "That is precisely why we must uncover the truth." As they left the inn, the crisp air carried a sense of urgency. Somewhere, the cursed painting still existed, along with the secret that had already claimed 2 lives, and Miss Marple was determined to find it before it claimed another. Chapter 7. The Vanishing Portrait. Inspector Graves was not a patient man, and it showed as he paced outside the White Hart Inn, his coat flapping with each irritated step. Edward Bryce, more composed, adjusted his gloves as he turned to Miss Marple. "So, we now know that Leonard Ashcombe feared something hidden beneath the portrait. Sir Quentin must have uncovered this, or at least suspected it. And then he was killed." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Which raises the question, where is the portrait now?" Graves stopped pacing. Lady Derwent claimed she didn't know where it was, but she could have been lying. Edward frowned. "Or perhaps someone else took it before she even knew it was missing." Miss Marple's expression was serene. "It is always wise to consider who benefits the most from an object vanishing." Graves grunted. "Fine. Let's start with who had access to it last." Returning to the Manor, the drive back to Derwent Manor was silent. Each lost in their thoughts. The grand house loomed before them, its windows dark, as though it, too, was keeping secrets. Lady Beatrice Derwent greeted them at the door, her usual composure strained. "Inspector, what now?" Graves wasted no time. "The portrait, Lady Derwent. It's missing. I want to know who had access to it in the days before your husband's death." Beatrice exhaled, pressing a hand to her temple. "You think I know?" Edward interjected smoothly. "You lived here, Lady Derwent. You must have noticed if anyone took an interest in it." Beatrice hesitated. "Well, Quentin did lock it away in his study." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Oh, that's rather interesting." Beatrice sighed. "Yes. The day before he died, I heard him speaking to someone about it. He was furious. He said something like, 'You don't understand. This is dangerous.'" Graves' eyes gleamed. "Who was he speaking to?" Beatrice shook her head. "I don't know. I wasn't close enough to hear a reply. But later that evening, I noticed something odd. The study door was slightly open." Edward's voice sharpened. "And did you look inside?" Beatrice hesitated. "I did. The painting was still there then, but the next morning, after Quentin was found dead, it was gone. A growing suspect." Graves pulled out his notebook. "So the painting disappeared sometime during the night of Sir Quentin's death." He turned to Miss Marple. "That means someone stole it before we even began investigating." Miss Marple tapped her fingers against her handbag. "And I dare say, whoever took it must have been very aware of its true value, not monetary, but secrets." Edward frowned. "Which means our suspects remain the same. Lady Derwent, who might be protecting her husband's secrets. Andrew Pritchard, Quentin's assistant, who had access to the study. Vivian Mercer, the art dealer, who may have realized its hidden worth. And, of course, Gordon Tate, the housekeeper's son, who was often lurking where he shouldn't be." Graves scowled. "And let's not forget Leonard Ashcombe's past involvement. If he feared the portrait, perhaps someone connected to him took it to keep it hidden forever." Miss Marple smiled. "A very logical thought, Inspector. A new clue. Just then, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Andrew Pritchard appeared, looking hesitant. "I heard you were back," he said, his voice tight. Graves wasted no time. "Where were you on the night of Sir Quentin's death?" Andrew's jaw tightened. "I was in my room, sleeping." Edward gave a sharp look. "Can anyone confirm that?" Andrew hesitated. "No, But I swear, I had nothing to do with this. Miss Marple's voice was mild. You were quite close to Sir Quentin, were you not? Andrew exhaled. Yes, he trusted me with his work. Graves folded his arms. Then, why didn't you report the painting missing? You must have noticed it was gone. Andrew swallowed. I thought it had been put away. Sir Quentin sometimes moved things when he was working. Miss Marple studied him carefully. And yet, you're nervous, Mr. Pritchard. Andrew's eyes darted toward the staircase. Because I know what you're thinking, that I stole it. But I swear, I didn't. Graves' gaze narrowed. Then, do you know who did? Andrew hesitated, then nodded. I don't have proof, but I have a suspicion. They all leaned in. Andrew took a deep breath. Vivian Mercer. The art dealer's gammied word frowned. Vivian Mercer. What makes you suspect her? Andrew's voice grew urgent. She was here that afternoon, the day before Quentin died. He had asked her to examine the painting again. I overheard her saying something odd, something like, if what you say is true, this could change everything. Miss Marple's fingers twitched. And how did Sir Quentin respond? Andrew hesitated. He said, it's too dangerous, Vivian. I should have never uncovered it. Graves cursed under his breath. Then, we need to speak to her now. An empty gallery thea arrived at Mercer's art gallery, just as dusk settled over the village. A small closed sign hung on the door, but Graves pounded on it regardless. No response. Graves scowled. She's avoiding us. Miss Marple stepped closer, peering through the glass. Or, perhaps, she's already gone. Edward checked the door handle. It was locked. We need to find a way in. Graves pulled out his pocket torch and shone it inside. There's movement at the back. A shadow flickered inside. Edward stiffened. She's in there. Graves pounded the door again. Vivian Mercer. Open up, or I'll have reason to believe you're obstructing an investigation. Silence. Then, a rustling sound. Miss Marple's voice was mild. She's trying to leave. Graves had no patience left. He stepped back and gave the door a sharp kick. It didn't budge. Just then, a side door creaked open. A figure stepped out, wrapped in a dark coat. Vivian Mercer's face was pale in the dim light. I don't have time for questions, she said, her voice shaking. Graves stepped forward. Oh, you do. Where's the painting? Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. Gone. Edward's voice was sharp. Gone. Where? Vivian hesitated, then whispered, I tried to stop them. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Them. Vivian swallowed. I wasn't the only one interested in it. Someone else got to it first. Graves' patience snapped. Who? Vivian's voice dropped lower. They took it last night. And if you don't find it soon, someone else is going to die. A cold silence settled over them. Miss Marple studied Vivian carefully, the tremor in her hands, the fear in her eyes. The painting is the key, she murmured. And now, it's in the wrong hands. Edward's voice was grim. Then we have to get it back. Before it's too late. As they stepped back into the night, the shadows seemed to deepen around them. Somewhere, the vanished portrait held the secret that had already taken 2 lives, and unless they found it soon, it would claim another. Chapter 8. A Trail of Vanishing. Clues. Vivian Mercer's fearful eyes darted between them, her fingers gripping the lapels of her coat as though bracing against an invisible force. The air outside her gallery was crisp, but the tension made it stifling. Inspector Graves took a firm step forward. You said they took it. Who are you talking about? Vivian exhaled shakily, glancing over her shoulder. I don't know exactly, but I was being watched. Edward Bryce's expression sharpened. By whom? Vivian shook her head. I noticed it 2 nights ago, before Sir Quentin was killed. A man standing outside the gallery. Then another, a different night. They weren't villagers. When I went to confront them, they vanished. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but firm. And then the painting disappeared. Vivian swallowed. Yes, Graves scowled. You must have some idea who they were working for. Vivian hesitated. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, I think it's someone connected to Leonard Ashcombe. A heavy silence followed. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. My dear, that is a rather serious claim. Vivian nodded. I know, but there's more. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. I found this in my office after the painting vanished. Graves snatched it and unfolded it. The message was scrawled hastily in dark ink. Forget what you saw. It is already too late. Edward's face darkened. A threat. Miss Marple examined the handwriting carefully. Or a warning. Graves's patience was wearing thin. Enough riddles. We need to get to Ashcombe, if he knows more than he's saying. Vivian interrupted, shaking her head. No, you don't understand. Ashcombe is dead. A stunned pause followed. Edward's voice was quiet. What? Vivian's expression was grim. I heard it not an hour ago. Leonard Ashcombe was found, dead this morning. Miss Marple's knitting stopped. Graves swore under his breath. Then the stakes have just changed. Leonard Ashcombe's House of Secrets journey to Leonard Ashcombe's crumbling estate was tense. When they arrived, a constable stood guard outside, nodding grimly at Graves. Sir, the young man greeted. It's bad. Graves strode inside, the others following closely behind. Ashcombe's study was in disarray. Papers scattered, books knocked over. But what drew their attention was the body slumped over the desk. Leonard Ashcombe's head lay awkwardly against the wood, his face frozen in an expression of shock. A spilled glass of brandy lay nearby. Graves cursed. Poison. Miss Marple stepped forward, observing the scene carefully. A desperate act, or a silencing. Edward moved to the desk, scanning the papers. It looks like someone was searching for something. Graves turned to the constable, who found him. The man hesitated. His housekeeper, sir. She said he locked himself in here last night. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. And did he have any visitors? The constable hesitated. One. A woman. She left in a hurry. Edward tensed. Who? The constable scratched his head. She gave her name as Vivian Mercer. A shocked silence followed. A web of Vivian's face paled. That's impossible. I wasn't here last night. Graves narrowed his eyes. You expect me to believe someone used your name? Vivian looked desperate. I swear it. I was in my gallery all evening. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Then it seems someone is trying to frame you, my dear. Edward studied the desk again. A half-written letter lay beneath Ashcombe's arm. Carefully, he eased it free. The painting was never meant to be seen again. If it is uncovered, everything unravels. I am already being watched. I must. The sentence trailed off. Edward muttered. He was about to reveal something. Graves scowled, and someone stopped him. Miss Marple's sharp eyes moved toward the desk drawers. Inspector, if you don't mind. Graves pulled them open. Inside, neatly folded, was an old photograph. Miss Marple took it carefully. It was faded but unmistakable. A much younger Leonard Ashcombe stood beside a woman. Her face was striking. Familiar. Edward inhaled sharply. That's Eleanor Hargreaves. Vivian frowned. But why would he keep her photograph? Miss Marple's voice was soft. Perhaps because Eleanor Hargreaves was more than a lady's maid. A hidden past. Graves turned to the constable. Bag this letter and photograph. We need to look into this woman's history. Edward exhaled. So Eleanor, now Ellen Harris, was tied to Ashcombe in more ways than we thought. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And I suspect she may know more than she has admitted. Vivian was still shaking her head. I don't understand. If someone used my name, they wanted to implicate me. Graves's eyes narrowed. Which means they're close to you. Someone who would know you had reason to visit Ashcombe. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Or someone who wanted to draw our attention elsewhere while they took what they truly needed. Edward's voice was grim. The painting. Graves clenched his jaw. We need to go back to Ellen Harris. Ellen's final confession. White Hart Inn was quiet when they arrived. The innkeeper greeted them nervously. Miss Harris? Graves demanded. The innkeeper hesitated. She left this morning. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. And did she leave anything behind? The innkeeper hesitated, then handed over a sealed envelope. Edward opened it carefully, scanning the brief note aloud. I have tried to outrun the past, but the past is not finished with me. The portrait is the key. If you find it, you will know the truth, but beware. Someone else wants it more than you do, and they will kill for it. A cold silence settled over them. Miss Marple tapped the note. Ellen has run, but she has left us the most important clue yet. Graves's voice was low. We need to find that painting before the killer does. Edward exhaled. If it isn't already too late. Miss Marple folded the note carefully. Then we must move quickly. As they stepped back into the evening air, a distinct feeling settled over them. The killer was still ahead of them than now. It was a race against time. Chapter 9. Shadows in the past. Evening air was cool and crisp as Miss Marple, Edward Bryce, Inspector Graves, and Vivian Mercer left the White Hart in Ellen Harris's note clutched in Edward's hand. The weight of her words lingered in their minds. The portrait is the key. If you find it, you will know the truth, but beware. Someone else wants it more than you do, and they will kill for it. Vivian hugged her coat tighter. She's running, isn't she? Ellen Harris. She knows something but is too afraid to stay. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but thoughtful. Fear is a powerful thing, my dear. It can drive people to desperate actions. But fear, more often than not, leaves clues behind. Inspector Graves grunted. Well, that's assuming we can find any before someone else turns up dead. Edward's voice was tense. We need to find that painting. It's the only way we'll understand what's really going on. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Then, perhaps, it is time we take a closer look at Eleanor Hargreaves's past. If we uncover her secrets, we may find what the killer is so desperate to hide. The missing years. Next morning, Edward arranged for records to be retrieved on Eleanor Hargreaves. It took some time, but by midday, the pieces started coming together. Edward unfolded an old employment record, scanning the details. Eleanor worked at Ashcombe House as a lady's maid. She left rather abruptly. Vivian peered over his shoulder. It says here she left due to personal circumstances. That could mean anything. Graves snorted. Could mean she was dismissed, or that she had a secret to keep. Miss Marple reached for another document, a marriage certificate. Oh my, how interesting. Edward leaned in. Who did she marry? Miss Marple's voice was calm but laced with curiosity. It appears Eleanor Hargreaves later became Mrs. Eleanor Bryce. Edward's head snapped up. Bryce. Vivian's eyes widened. That's your surname. Edward's face paled slightly. It can't be. He snatched the paper, scanning the details. But there it was, in plain ink. Eleanor Hargreaves had married Charles Bryce, his father. A family connection. A tense silence followed. Edward sat down heavily, his mind racing. Eleanor, she was my mother. Miss Marple's expression remained sympathetic. It would seem so, dear boy. Graves cursed. Well, that changes things. Vivian looked between them. But Edward, if Eleanor was your mother, why did she change her name? Why keep it a secret? Edward exhaled sharply. My father never spoke of her. He always told me my mother died when I was very young. Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. Then perhaps it was not her death he was concealing, but her past. Edward shook his head in disbelief. But why? What was so dangerous about it? Miss Marple gave a small smile. That, dear Edward, is what we must discover. A sudden interruption buffered. They could process this revelation further. The door to the study burst open. A constable rushed in, looking breathless. Inspector, there's been an incident at Derwent Manor. Graves was on his feet in an instant. What now? The constable swallowed. Another murder, sir. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. Edward's hands clenched into fists. Who? The constable hesitated. Andrew Pritchard. Death at Derwent Manorthy. Arrived at Derwent Manor to find chaos. Servants whispered anxiously, and Lady Beatrice Derwent stood in the hallway, pale and shaken. Inspector Graves wasted no time. Where's the body? Beatrice gestured wordlessly toward the study. Andrew Pritchard lay slumped over Sir Quentin's desk, much like Ashcombe had been. His face was frozen in terror, his fingers curled tightly around the edge of the desk. A glass lay overturned beside him. Poison again. Edward exhaled. It's the same as Ashcombe. Miss Marple leaned in, her keen eyes studying the scene. Then she noticed something that made her pause. Andrew's left hand was slightly opened, as if he had been holding something before he died, but now it was gone. She turned to Beatrice. Lady Derwent, was anything taken from this room? Beatrice shook her head. No, not that I noticed. Miss Marple's gaze moved around the study. Something was missing. Something Andrew had been trying to hold on to. Inspector Graves ran a hand through his hair. So, Pritchard was silenced. That much is obvious. The question is, what did he know? A faint Cluedward's voice was grim. Or rather, what did he find? Miss Marple turned to the desk and gently ran a hand across its surface. Then, she smiled softly. There was something here. A paper, perhaps, a message, and now, it is gone. Vivian frowned. But who could have taken it? No one was here except Lady Derwent. Graves shot Beatrice a suspicious look. And you're sure you saw nothing? Beatrice bristled up. Course not. She paused. Wait, I did hear something. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. Go on, dear. Beatrice swallowed. Before I entered the study, I heard the sound of shuffling, as if someone had just left. But when I stepped in, Andrew was already dead. Graves turned to the constable. "Did you see anyone leaving the manor?" The constable hesitated. "No, sir. But there was a carriage leaving the village rather quickly." Edward's voice was sharp. "Where was it headed?" The constable glanced away. "Toward the coast." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And I believe we must follow it." Inspector Graves turned toward his men. "I want roadblocks set up. If that carriage is carrying the painting, we can't let it leave town." Edward's jaw was tight. "And if we're too late?" Miss Marple's voice was mild but unwavering. "Then we must hope that the past has left us enough breadcrumbs to follow." The race was on. And now, the killer was moving faster than ever. Chapter 10. A Race Against Temeth. Urgency in the air was palpable as Miss Marple, Inspector Graves, Edward Bryce, and Vivian Mercer prepared to leave Derwent Manor. The knowledge that a carriage had been seen speeding toward the coast could mean only one thing: the killer, or someone connected to the crime, was attempting to flee. Inspector Graves barked orders to his constables. "Set up roadblocks along every route leading to the coastline. Stop every carriage, every motor car. No one leaves the area without being questioned." The constables hurried to carry out his command, while Edward turned to Miss Marple. "You really think the painting is in that carriage?" Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "It is a strong possibility, dear boy. But whether the painting is being taken away, or returned to its rightful place, that is the true question." Vivian frowned. "Returned? Why would the killer risk bringing it back?" Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "Perhaps because the painting itself is a greater danger than we imagined." Edward exhaled sharply. "Then we have no time to waste." A sudden disappearance before they could reach their own carriage. A breathless constable ran toward them. His face was pale with urgency. "Inspector, there's been another development." Graves scowled. "What now?" The constable hesitated. "It's Ellen Harris, sir. She's gone." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. "Gone?" The young man nodded. "The innkeeper checked her room not long after you left. She wasn't there, and some of her belongings were missing. No one saw her leave." Edward swore under his breath. "She knew we were closing in." Graves's jaw tightened. "She could be in that carriage." Miss Marple, however, appeared unconvinced. "Or she could be in far greater danger than we anticipated." Vivian swallowed. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "If Ellen Harris was truly the one behind these murders, she would not need to flee. But if she was close to revealing something the killer wished to keep hidden, then she would be a target." Edward muttered. "Then we need to find her before they have." "Do." Graves motioned toward their waiting carriage. "Let's move. If that carriage is heading to the coast, we'll intercept it." The coastal pursueth journey toward the coastline was tense. The roads were rough, the night closing in fast. Graves sat beside the driver, scanning the roads ahead, while Edward and Vivian watched from the windows. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained deep in thought. Edward turned to her. "You've figured something out, haven't you?" She looked up, eyes twinkling. "Not entirely, dear boy, but I do believe we are looking at this mystery from the wrong angle." Vivian frowned. "How so?" Miss Marple's voice was calm. "We assumed the painting was stolen to be hidden away. But what if it was taken to be destroyed?" Edward sat back, realization dawning. "Because it contains something the killer cannot allow to be seen." Graves called from the front. "There's movement up ahead." A carriage. The horses picked up speed. The distant carriage, barely visible against the fading light, was moving fast. Graves turned to his driver. "Faster." The chase had begun. Unexpected turnus they gained on the carriage. Edward leaned out the window. "There's someone inside. I can see movement." Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "We must be careful. If the killer is inside, they may not surrender easily." Vivian clutched the edge of her seat. "What if Ellen is in there?" Graves didn't take his eyes off the carriage. "Then we'll find out soon enough." The pursuing constables rode ahead, forcing the carriage to slow. The driver, realizing he was trapped, yanked the reins hard, bringing the horses to a shuddering halt. Edward and Graves leaped out first, approaching with caution. The coachman, a wiry man with sweat on his brow, raised his hands. "Don't shoot. I was paid to drive, that's all." Graves ignored him, flinging open the carriage door. Inside sat Ellen Harris. She was pale, her expression unreadable. In her lap rested something wrapped in cloth. Graves stepped forward. "Ellen Harris, you've got a lot to answer for." The truth behind the portrait. Ellen looked at them. then unwrapped the cloth. Inside was the missing portrait. Vivian gasped. Edward stared in disbelief. Graves's voice was sharp. Where did you get that? Ellen's voice was quiet. I took it. A stunned silence followed. Edward's voice was slow. Then you admit you stole it? Ellen shook her head. I was trying to protect it. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Because of what it reveals. Len hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Vivian whispered. What's so special about this painting? Ellen's hands trembled. Because it's not just a portrait, it's a confession. Edward inhaled sharply. A confession. Ellen met his gaze. Look closer. Miss Marple reached for the portrait, her fingers trailing over the surface. Then she smiled. It's been altered. Vivian frowned. What? Miss Marple's voice was firm. The paint is layered. There is something beneath this image, Graves muttered. Then we need to uncover it. Miss Marple folded her hands. Indeed, Inspector, but we must do so carefully. For once we reveal the truth, the real danger begins. The night air was thick with tension. They had the painting. They had the key to the mystery. But now, the killer had nothing left to lose. Chapter 11. The portrait's secret carriage ride back to the village was tense. The painting lay between them, wrapped in cloth, its secret still hidden beneath layers of paint. Ellen Harris sat stiffly, her fingers clutching the edges of her shawl, while Edward Bryce stared at her with barely concealed frustration. Inspector Graves, sitting opposite them, exhaled sharply. Let's go through this again, Miss Harris. You claim you stole the portrait not to hide it, but to protect it. From whom? Elon's voice was quiet but steady. From whoever killed Andrew Pritchard, and from whoever killed the others before him. Vivian Mercer leaned forward. Then why run? If you're innocent, why not come forward? Ellen's hands trembled slightly as she looked down. Because I knew no one would believe me, and because I was afraid I'd be next. Miss Ma, ever calm, regarded her carefully. Fear is a terrible thing, Miss Harris, but so is silence when it allows evil to go unchecked. Ellen swallowed. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I only wanted to uncover the truth. But I didn't realize how much danger it would put me in. Edward's jaw tightened. And what truth would that be? Ellen hesitated, then placed a hand on the wrapped painting. The truth hidden in here. Layers of deception. The time they reached Edward's house, the urgency to examine the painting had overtaken any other concerns. Miss Marple directed them to set up a table with proper lighting, and Edward fetched a small knife and a cloth. Inspector Graves folded his arms. So, you think there's something beneath the surface? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, I know there is. Vivian's voice was hushed. But what? Edward unwrapped the painting carefully. The portrait itself was still eyes staring back at them, an almost knowing smirk on the subject's lips. It was the image of Eleanor Hargreaves, painted in exquisite but eerie detail. Ellen spoke softly. It's not just a portrait. It's a message. Miss Marple pointed at the corners of the frame. See here. The edges of the paint are uneven, and look at the brushstrokes near the neckline, almost as if something was covered over. Graves muttered, well, let's find out. With delicate precision, Edward scraped away a small section of paint. The room fell silent as the underlying image began to emerge. A shocking revelation, Vivian gasped. Good Lord! Beneath the portrait of Eleanor Hargreaves lay another face, partially obscured but unmistakable. It was a man with piercing blue eyes, a strong jawline, and a cruel smirk. Edward's hand shook as he whispered, That's my father. Miss Marple's expression did not waver. Yes, dear boy. And now we know why this portrait was so dangerous. Graves scowled. Why would someone paint over his face? Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. Perhaps because the truth was too dangerous to reveal. Ellen took a deep breath. I found letters, old letters between Eleanor Hargreaves and Charles Bryce. She was afraid of him, terrified. Edward turned to her sharply. That's impossible. My father was respected. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Respectability can be a mask, Edward. It appears Eleanor Hargreaves was not merely the subject of this portrait. She was the victim of a terrible secret. Vivian's voice was hushed. And someone has been killing to keep it hidden. A motive for murder. Inspector Graves ran a hand over his face. So let's lay it out. Eleanor Hargreaves was involved with Charles Bryce. Something happened between them, something she wanted to reveal, but before she could, she disappeared. Ellen nodded, and someone ensured that her story would never come to light. Edward exhaled. And now, Decades later, this painting resurfaces. Anyone who came close to discovering its secrets, Vivian finished the sentence, was silenced. Miss Marple's expression was calm. Exactly, Graves muttered, but who's the killer now? Who still has a reason to protect a dead man's secrets? Miss Marple tapped her fingers on the table. That, Inspector, is what we must determine. A dangerous visitor. Just as the weight of the revelation settled, a knock came at the door. Everyone froze. Graves motioned for silence. Edward hesitated, then moved cautiously toward the door. He peered through the peephole and frowned. It's Beatrice Derwent. Vivian muttered. What is she doing here at this hour? Graves gestured. Let her in. Edward unlocked the door, and Lady Beatrice stepped inside, her face pale. Her usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by something rougher. She glanced around the room, her eyes resting on the exposed painting. Then she whispered, You've found it. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed we have, Lady Derwent. Beatrice swallowed. Then you know the truth. Edward's voice was sharp. What truth? Beatrice's hands trembled. The truth about Eleanor Hargreaves, and the truth about Charles Bryce. Miss Marple studied her carefully. You knew, didn't you? Beatrice exhaled shakily. I didn't want to believe it, but when I heard about the deaths, about the painting, I knew it was all connected. Graves narrowed his eyes. And yet you never said a word. Beatrice's voice was desperate. Because I was afraid. Vivian frowned. Afraid of what? Beatrice's lips parted, but before she could speak aloud, crash shattered the moment. Glass exploded inward. The room plunged into darkness as the lanterns were knocked over. A gust of wind tore through the open door, then a gunshot. Someone screamed. Miss Marple's voice cut through the chaos. Get down. Edward grabbed Vivian, pulling her to the ground. Graves drew his weapon. Who fired? Who's there? Silence. Miss Marple's voice was calm despite the danger. We are not alone. They had uncovered the truth. And now, the killer had come for them. Chapter 12. The killer unmasked. Death Room was plunged into chaos. The gunshot had shattered a window, and the cold night air swept in, snuffing out what remained of the overturned lanterns. In the dim light, Miss Marple remained still, listening. The others had ducked behind furniture, breaths held as they waited for another shot. Inspector Graves gritted his teeth, gun raised. Who's there? Silence. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone was moving outside. Edward, keeping low, crawled toward the window. He peered through the broken glass, his eyes straining against the darkness. A figure, shadowed, indistinct, was slipping away toward the trees. There, he hissed. Graves sprang into action. Stay here. Lock the doors. I'll take my men and track them. Before anyone could protest, he was gone, calling for his constables. Footsteps thundered down the path as they gave chase. Vivian let out a shaky breath. Who was it? The killer. Miss Marple stood and, with surprising calm, relit a lantern. It would seem so, my dear, but not to silence us. No, this was an act of desperation. Edward frowned. Desperation. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the painting. It lay untouched, despite the chaos. They did not come to kill. They came to destroy the portrait. A final confession. Lady Beatrice Derwent was still shaking, her hands clenched around the back of a chair. Miss Marple regarded her with gentle patience. You were about to say something before the shot rang out. Lady Derwent. Beatrice's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I knew Charles Bryce. Not well, but well enough. Edward's jaw tightened. He was my father. Beatrice's eyes met his, sorrowful, yes. And Eleanor Hargreaves was his greatest regret. Vivian's breath hitched. What do you mean? Beatrice exhaled shakily. Charles loved her, or, at least, he thought he did, but Eleanor, she wanted to leave him. She was in love with someone else. Miss Marple's expression did not change, and he couldn't bear to lose her. Beatrice nodded. Yes, one night there was a terrible row. No one knows exactly what happened, but the next morning, Eleanor was gone, vanished. The story was that she ran away, but some of us suspected otherwise. Edward's voice was hoarse. And you never said anything. Beatrice's voice cracked. What could I say? There was no proof. And your father, he was a powerful man, respected. Who would believe that he had done something terrible? Miss Marple spoke softly. And yet, someone knew. Someone who painted over his face to hide the truth. Ellen Harris stepped forward. And someone who has been killing to keep it hidden. A dark past resurfaces door burst open, and Inspector Graves strode in. breathless. His expression was grim. We lost them. Whoever it was, they knew the area too well. Slipped away, into the woods. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. They are growing desperate, Inspector. And desperate killers make mistakes. Graves exhaled sharply. Then let's lay it out. We now know Charles Bryce was connected to Eleanor Hargreaves. If he killed her, the portrait was the only piece of evidence left. Edward's voice was strained. And now someone is willing to kill to keep it covered up. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Oh, Edward, I do not believe this is about covering up the past anymore. Vivian blinked. What do you mean? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together as she thought. If this were simply about burying a secret, the painting would have been destroyed long ago. Instead, it was stolen, hidden, and now someone is trying to reclaim it. Ellen whispered, because it's valuable. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Because it is proof. Graves's gaze sharpened. Proof of what? Miss Marple turned to Lady Beatrice. My dear, you knew Charles Bryce well. Tell me, did he have any living relatives, apart from Edward? Beatrice hesitated. No, at least, none that he acknowledged. Miss Marple nodded. Then I suspect that someone else had a claim to his legacy, and they are willing to kill for it. A name in the dark. Tension in the room was thick. Edward clenched his fists. If that's true, then we need to find out who. Vivian turned to Miss Marple. You know, don't you, Miss Marple? Expression was kind but firm. I have my suspicions, my dear. But I do not deal in suspicions, I deal in facts. Inspector Graves folded his arms. And what facts do you have? Miss Marple smiled. The killer tried to shoot through the window, did they not? And yet, not a single bullet struck the painting. Ellen gasped. You mean, they missed on purpose? Miss Marple nodded. Or perhaps they wanted us to think they were trying to destroy the painting, when in reality, they were trying to scare us away from it. Edward inhaled sharply. Then the answer is in the portrait itself. Miss Marple gestured toward it. We must finish uncovering what lies beneath. Graves grabbed the knife and resumed scraping. Slowly, painstakingly, more details emerged. The hidden man's face became clearer, and beside him, faintly, another figure began to appear. Vivian whispered, Who is that? Beatrice's face turned white. No, it can't be. Edward's pulse pounded. Who? Beatrice's voice trembled. My brother. The final connection. A stunned silence followed. Then, Graves cursed under his breath. Of course, Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Yes, Inspector. It was never about Charles Bryce alone, it was about his accomplice. Vivian's voice was hoarse. Beatrice, are you saying that your brother? Beatrice's eyes were filled with tears. I never wanted to believe it, but yes, he was with Charles Bryce the night Eleanor disappeared. He helped cover it up. Edward felt as though the floor had dropped beneath him. Then that means, Miss Marple nodded. The person killing to keep this secret hidden is someone protecting his name, someone who still has something to lose. Graves's voice was sharp. Then we're looking for someone with a direct connection to Beatrice's family. Miss Marple folded her hands. And I do believe I know who it is. Vivian's voice was hushed. Who? Miss Marple smiled. Patience, dear, we shall set a trap. And by tomorrow evening, the killer will reveal themselves. The room was silent. The final game was about to begin. Thank you for tuning in to Mystery Unlocked. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive until next time.